Oh, welcome everybody. My name is Kylie Hanish and I'm the founder of Return to Zero Hope. We're a nonprofit organization that supports families, parents, and everyone impacted by perinatal loss. So today, I'm so honored to have Heather Ratych join us, and she's going to be talking about families' mental health after perinatal loss. And so Heather is a registered social worker and a psychotherapist who is a perinatal mental health certified. She runs Bloom Psychotherapy, a large group practice in Ontario, Canada, which specializes in working with families and individuals throughout the infertility, pregnancy, and postpartum periods of life. Heather has a passion for working with those who've experienced traumatic births, perinatal loss, and those who are grieving. She is a mom of 3 who is passionate about helping women thrive and in supporting them to feel grounded, confident, and connected. So thank you so much, Heather, for being here today. And I'm going to hand it off to you. I will share my screen first.
Thank you. Excellent. Thanks so much, Kylie. I'm really excited to be here with everybody today. As I was sort of putting this presentation together over the past couple of weeks, I recognized that I could probably talk for 3 or 4 hours. Bear with me as I try and move fairly quickly to make sure I cover everything today. So if you can just move to the first slide, Kylie, that would be great. Excellent. So perinatal loss is often a traumatic and unexpected outcome for families expecting a baby. While there has been substantial research about how parents experience and cope with these losses, information about mental health outcomes for bereaved parents has been sparse. Some of the research that has been done is 2 or 3 decades old, and most research has used small cohorts, convenient sampling, and is not representative in terms of socioeconomic status of women who actually experience loss and their families as well. There are particularly large gaps in understanding mental health outcomes for women of color, despite the fact that Black women have much higher risks for perinatal loss. The loss of an infant through stillbirth, or neonatal death is recognized as a traumatic life event. Despite the prevalence of this type of death and its psychosocial repercussions, international associations such as the International Stillbirth Alliance have for many years minimized the gaps in support services for couples following a perinatal death. While there have been several recommendations to improve perinatal bereavement awareness and support for families, in practice, support remains structured, and more specifically, the provision of health and social services to grieving parents is fragmented, uneven across regions, and often not father or non-birthing partner inclusive. Well, we don't always understand what causes neonatal or stillbirth, neonatal deaths or stillbirth. There are many complex factors, but regardless of the causes, the results are tragic. Families who lose a baby, either after 20 weeks of pregnancy or during the first hours, days, weeks, months, or years of life, suffer incredible trauma. Their loss has huge implications for the well-being of the couple, for any siblings that were born before the loss, and for any children born after the loss. Impacts on the mental health of and mothers, as well as the effects on the relationship, indicate the urgent need for better supports to parents experiencing the perinatal death of their child, making perinatal death a pressing societal issue that I'm going to talk about today. You can just move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the loss of a baby is unfortunately more common than many may know, partly due to the fact that it is still often. I just wanted you to consider the following statistics. So approximately 50% of pregnancies that are confirmed end up in miscarriage or stillbirth. You can actually go to the next slide, Kylie, thanks. Each year in the States, approximately 24,000 babies, or 1 out of every births, are born still. And around 1 to 2% of women experience repeat miscarriages, which is defined as 3 consecutive miscarriages in the first 20 weeks of pregnancy. After a woman experiences 2 pregnancy losses, her chance of a future miscarriage is 30%. After experiencing 3 losses, her chance of miscarriage rises to 33%. The next slide would be great, please. While perinatal bereavement is as painful as other types of bereavement, there are some important distinctions to be made. So first, perinatal loss often involves a sense of biological failure, loss of identity, a lack of shared memories, and possibly declining hopes for the future. Parents who lose children before birth never have the opportunity to interact with them as separate living individuals. Parents who lose infants after a period of neonatal care may never have the opportunity to care for them at home. Grieving after a perinatal death resembles other forms of bereavement, with depressed mood, anger, irritability, preoccupation, anxiety, and changes in eating and sleeping patterns, all being very typical responses. Distress can preclude return for many months or longer after a baby's death, and significant distress is often experienced for years. Complications such as major depression or post-traumatic stress symptoms may also occur, and parents should be made aware of signs and symptoms by their healthcare providers. Ongoing consultation with a mental health specialist may be essential in these situations. And from my experience, I would say it is almost always essential that we're at least offering some consultation and some support, either preemptively or when parents are feeling ready. Can you just move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Perinatal death has real consequences for both parents, if there are 2 parents. For more than 20 years, studies conducted internationally have shown that both bereaved parents experience heavy loss and intense grief, and have similar reactions over time. Perinatal death and bereavement have significant adverse effect on women's and men's mental health up to 5 years later. Many studies have revealed the magnitude of depression, anxiety, and grief complex over time as well. This type of loss can cause severe distress, presenting as depression, anxiety, disorder, phobia, post-traumatic stress, and or suicidal ideations. Next slide, please. Grief is the pain that comes following a loss. It is an individual experience that can vary significantly from person to person. For many families, physical and psychological symptoms are common following a perinatal loss. The path of grieving after these types of losses is individual, and each person's unique physiological, psychological, and spiritual responses are real and valid. They are a normal result of the deep pain of grief, and these symptoms may wax and wane over time. However, it's really important to note and to remember that there is no right way to walk this journey. Research has begun to focus on somatization and post-traumatic stress related to perinatal death. A recent study found that 16% of women who lost a child in the first 20 weeks of pregnancy had suicidal thoughts. These symptoms persist during the next pregnancy, and in some women after the birth of a subsequent child, if they go on to have more children. I think it's really important to note that number because we already know there is a risk of suicidal thoughts or self-harming behavior in the postpartum period for a number of women who have any risk factors. But this is a pretty significant statistic to be aware of and to help us to ensure that we're constantly screening women. If you can go to the next slide, that would be great, actually. Grief reactions of a child are similar to those after other losses, but they're often more intense and last longer. Those who have experienced loss may experience the following grief reactions: intense shock, confusion, disbelief, and denial, even if your child's death was expected. Overwhelming sadness and despair, such that facing daily tasks or even getting out of bed can seem impossible. Extreme guilt or a feeling that you have failed as your child's protector and could have done something differently. intense anger and feelings of bitterness and unfairness at a life left unfulfilled, fear or dread of being alone and overprotecting your surviving children, resentment towards parents with healthy children or children who are here, feeling that life has no meaning and wishing to be released from the pain or to join your child. This is another really common one that I see in my practice. Questioning or losing faith or spiritual beliefs, dreaming about your child or feeling your child's presence nearby, loneliness and isolation, even when around other people, and feeling that no one can truly understand how you feel. Perinatal losses are typically unexpected events, unable to plan or emotionally prepare for them, which can make it even more challenging to cope with these losses. Many families feel strongly connected to their babies despite not having met them in person, and this can't be minimized by healthcare professionals. Next slide, please. Grief after a perinatal loss can cause physical symptoms that are similar to symptoms of depression. They can range from mild to severe. Families, the physical symptoms of grief can be severe enough to interfere with their ability to function at work or at school, keep up with responsibilities at home, and care for other children. Physical symptoms of grief following a loss can include sleeping problems, either sleeping too much or too little, appetite loss or an increase in appetite, heart palpitations or chest pain, shaking stomach problems or butterflies in your stomach, being weak or run down, or becoming physically ill. It is clearly important to assure that the parents are cared for after the loss of their child. Although grief is always profound when a child dies, some parents have an especially difficult time. Even as time passes, their grief remains intense and they feel it impossible to return to a normal life. Some parents may think about hurting themselves or ending their lives to escape from the pain that they're feeling. Next slide, please. Grieving the loss of a loved one tears open our hearts and our lives and seems to make time stand still as we search for ways to make sense of the loss and what it means to our whole entire lives. We may cry, we may eat more or less, we may not be able to sleep, we may long for our loved ones and wonder how we will ever be able to live without them. Perinatal loss is a psychological trauma. A great number of studies have been done on the psychosocial impact of loss on mothers over the past 30 years. And the findings are quite interesting. We know that individuals may experience a range of feelings when dealing with the loss, including shock, anger, guilt, and sadness. These emotions can be overwhelming, but they're all normal reactions and responses to this type of loss. There is no order or timeline for how long the grief process may take, and symptoms may never completely go away. Instead, recovery from a loss means that a person still thinks about the loss, but is able to accept what has happened. They may continue to feel sad and anxious from time to time or often, but these symptoms no longer significantly interfere with their ability to function. Each person's experience of grief is different, and people sometimes go through the same stage more than once. Some people expect that grief should be resolved over a period of time or a specific period of time. So I do hear this year-long marker used often, but this is actually not true. While there is no specific timeline for grief, studies on perinatal loss have found that depression may peak around 6 months after the loss and then gradually decrease over the first year. The initial severe and intense grief felt will not be continuous. However, periods of intense grief often come and go over 18 months or longer. Over time, grief may come in waves that are gradually less intense and less frequent, but most people will always have some feelings of sadness and loss. Normal and to be expected. And I think it's really important that we validate this with the individuals that we're working with on a continuous basis. Even years after a baby's death, important events and milestones in the lives of other children can trigger grief. Significant days such as graduations, weddings, the first day of school are all common. And at these times, parents may find themselves thinking about how old their child would be or what he or she would look like or be doing if still alive. Next slide, please. So for some people, however, The feelings and emotions after suffering a loss are debilitating and do not improve even after a significant period of time has passed. This is known as complicated grief, also known as complex bereavement disorder. With complicated grief, painful emotions are so long severe that a person has trouble recovering from the loss and resuming their lives. Complicated grief occurs when the significant psychological burden on individuals causes them to develop long-term persistence or pathologic reactions. Grieving is not stage-like, predictable, or a process across time, and there are different patterns of normal, as well as complicated ways of grieving, as well as large individual or cultural differences in reaction to loss that we have to be aware of as well. A person who develops complicated grief may also experience other mental health symptoms like depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Depression, which involves sadness, guilt, and in some cases, suicidal thoughts, can affect all areas of a person's life. People with depression may feel hopeless and wonder if they will ever recover from the loss. Anxiety involves excessive worry and can happen following a loss as well as during future pregnancies and postpartum or parenting periods as well. Families may feel highly concerned about the risk of another loss. PTSD can develop if a family experiences a loss as traumatic. Symptoms of PTSD include intrusive thoughts about what happened, avoidance of reminders of the trauma, negative thoughts and feelings, and changes in arousal, such as being more easily startled. Predictors of the development after perinatal loss include older maternal age, a poor quality intimate partnership, lack of social support, which is a key factor, couples with a history of infertility and having no other living children, ambivalent attitudes or heightened perception of the reality of the pregnancy. Of special note, as this is important for healthcare providers to be aware of complicated grief was found high after termination of pregnancy for medical reasons. Next slide, please. So there are several symptoms that are associated with complicated grief disorder. The easiest way to depict the disorder is by describing it as being in an ongoing heightened state of mourning that prevents individuals from healing. The specific symptoms include intense sadness, pain, and contemplation over the loss of a loved one, inability to focus on anything other than the loss, either extreme focus or avoidance of reminders of a loved one, intense and persistent longing for their child, inability to accept the death, numbness or detachment, feelings of bitterness or that life held no purpose, lack of trust in others, and feelings of depression, deep sadness, guilt, or self-blame. It's important to note that all of these and they are an expected response after such an enormous loss. And when the healthcare provider is aware of these symptoms and is aware that they are normal, the ability to support a grieving couple individual is heightened enormously. Next slide, please. So the death of her baby impairs a mother's day-to-day functioning, and the finding that bereaved mothers have 4 times higher of developing depressive symptoms and 7 times higher odds of PTSD symptoms compared with non-bereaved parents underscores the powerful impact of this loss and the severe that it can create for parents. In multiple studies, mothers were found to report changed appetite and sleep patterns, decreased social participation, decreased marital satisfaction, and increased isolation. Further, in one study, 9 months after a loss, bereaved women showed remarkably high and persistent levels of distress measured by symptoms of depression and PTSD. It's notable that there were no significant differences in grief response or symptom level of these disorders between mothers losing a baby by miscarriage, stillbirth, or neonatal death. In multiple studies, women reported a discrepancy between the intensity of their grief and the extent to which they were allowed to express it. One study found that mothers with perinatal loss expressed their wishes that people acknowledge their losses, be considerate and sensitive, and give them a listening ear and emotional support. all things that we consistently hear in self-reports that mothers are lacking. Feelings such as guilt and anger were also endorsed in the research. After experiencing the loss of a baby, men feel they have failed as mothers. They feel responsible for what has happened because their body let them down and they didn't give birth to a healthy baby. It's not unusual for bereaved mothers to become their partners, or their other children's health. Their own mortality can come to the forefront. Mothers may believe that if a baby can die, so although this reaction usually fades with time, it is important for the anxiety mothers are feeling to be identified and treated. With time, some mothers also feel guilty when they start to feel a little bit better, as if they're not honoring their baby or are forgetting them. Some of the moms that I work with talk about a belief that they need to grieve and feel terrible for the rest of their lives in an attempt to remember and honor their baby. Anger is a very natural part of grief as well. Many parents direct this towards the hospital and at other times towards friends or family. For some women, it is a generalized anger at the undeservedness and injustice, and some may question, why me? All of these feelings are normal and to be expected. However, those grieving should always be supported and seeking out formal support and told that if they are worried about themselves, help and support are available to them. Next slide, please. Perinatal loss affects the entire family. While fathers may have a hard time coping with a loss, the ways in which mothers and fathers grieve may be vastly different. Research on fathers who have suffered a perinatal loss have found they tend to show less intense grief symptoms and grieve for shorter periods of time. They're also less likely to talk about the loss with other people, including their partners. It is important to note, however, that fathers and other partners can experience similar feelings around perinatal loss, including helplessness and loneliness, and their grief needs to be acknowledged and supported along with a female partner's pain. It also needs to be acknowledged that dads and partners can be forgotten after a baby dies. As everyone looks to the person who carried the baby, it's easy to overlook the fact that the other partner needs time and space to grieve as well. With some people expressing less emotion, it's easy to assume that they're okay, when in reality, some people find it difficult to express their emotions and their feelings can get locked up. This can be misunderstood as indifference to the loss of the baby, or just a lack of grief in general. Many partners take on the role of protector in the family, supporting their partner and not allowing time for their own grief. It is not unusual for some to take on the practicalities and keep themselves busy. Men can experience anxiety, depression, and PTSD after a pregnancy loss, but the research finds that this doesn't happen as frequently as it does for women. So don't misread a male partner's stoicism as not caring, and please always be careful not to make judgments around whether or not one partner is coping as well as the other, because oftentimes without digging a little bit further, it's difficult to assess this just by observing. Next slide, please. Research has found that perinatal loss is one of the most difficult events for a couple to experience. Couples who want children and did not expect the pregnancy to end or for a baby not to live can suffer extreme stress. When the baby dies, each parent may grieve differently, like we talked about. One parent may find that talking helps, while the other may need quiet time to grieve alone. The relationship between a partnership may be negatively impacted after a loss, and partners who grieve differently from one another are more likely to experience problems in their relationship. Cultural expectations and role differences also affect how parents grieve. Men are often expected to control their emotions, be strong, and take charge of the family. Women may be expected to cry openly and want to talk about their grief. If there's a conflict in this, or if either individual doesn't identify with the cultural norm, that can create more room for difficulty. If someone is a working parent, he or she may become more involved in their job to escape the sadness and daily reminders at home. A stay-at-home parent may be surrounded by constant reminders and may feel a lack of purpose now that his or her job as caregiver has abruptly ended. Differences in grieving can cause relationship difficulties at a time when both partners need each other's support the most. One parent may believe the other is not grieving properly, or that a lack of open grief means he or she loved the baby less. Further, couples who feel less satisfied in their marriage are also more likely to have a hard time coping with their grief in general. Relationships between couples can either break down or become stronger after loss, partly depending on how supported each partner feels by the other throughout the grief experience. Studies have revealed that men and women show different patterns of grief, potentially exacerbating this decline in the relationship. Although some couples may become closer after a perinatal death, this event does increase the risk of marital tensions, separations, and divorces, with the associated social costs that come along with those. Couples can benefit from open communication and understanding following a loss. And by working together, the couple may be able to work through their relationship. It is important for both partners to understand and accept one another's coping styles. As healthcare providers or professionals, we are able to work with a couple, either individually or together, to attempt to help them or support them to understand the other. Next slide, please. So while parents are the focus of attention when a child dies, grief of siblings is sometimes overlooked. The death of a sibling is a tremendous loss for a child. They lose a family member or a potential family member, a confidant, and a lifelong friend. Perinatal and infant loss has effects on the development of children born before or after the loss, and this impact warrants attention. Siblings may struggle, sometimes invisibly, with miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant loss. And as parents attempt to cope, siblings' questions and feelings of loss may inadvertently be overlooked. Healthcare providers can help parents understand how other children may be interpreting this death. While young children may not fully comprehend the permanence of death, they certainly can feel their world has become a less secure place. They may also fear that a baby's illness and/or death is somehow their fault. Helping siblings to understand that nothing they did, said, or thought caused illness or death is essential to family healing, along with reassuring siblings that they are healthy, safe, and loved. Older children may feel a strong and lasting sense of loss. When a parent is overwhelmed with their surviving, misinterpret this grief as a message that they are not as valued as much as the sibling who died was. Next slide, please. So children can be supported during this time of grief in providers. We are able to support parents in understanding children's grief and supporting them in finding resources either in the community or with family and friends. So one of these ways that we can support children is to make grief a shared family experience. We can include children in discussions about memorial plans. We can support parents in spending as much time as possible with their children, talking about their sibling or playing together. We can make sure children understand they are not responsible for a sibling's death and help them let go of regrets and guilt. We can set reasonable limits on their behavior or in doing this, but try not to be either overprotective or overly permissive. It is normal to feel protective of surviving children, but what they need most is a consistent response with flexibility to support them in navigating their grief journey. We can encourage close family members or friends to spend extra time with siblings if the parent's own grief prevents them from giving the children the attention that they need. Next slide. So non-recognition of perinatal bereavement occurs in medical and social. It is most pronounced, however, in the workplace. The few studies on this subject do show that perinatal bereavement is often considered a taboo subject in organizations, which leaves parents yet again. Parents also report difficulty in obtaining bereavement leave and must bear the financial costs associated with unpaid leave. Terms and conditions for returning to work are reported to often be rigid, and a gradual return or extension of leave is an emphasis on productivity, efficiency, results in parents often receiving comments that devalue their grief and the magnitude of their loss. Moreover, fathers' premature return to work due to a lack of paid leave often contributes to difficulties within the couple or the marital relationship and increases social isolation. Given the intensity and long-term consequences of perinatal bereavement, it is not surprising that many parents resume working while still in severe psychological distress. This is especially salient among fathers for whom bereavement leave following perinatal death is still minimal. This situation inevitably results in high rates of absenteeism or presenteeism, where you're at work physically, but unable to focus on the demands and in meeting deadlines and completing tasks and things that are required of your job. Further, this type of loss frequently affects a woman's place colleagues, particularly if she's not feeling supported, whether while she's off or with her return to work. Next slide. After this type of loss, a mother's values, beliefs, and spirituality can be challenged, as the experience of death at birth is an existential dilemma. Perinatal loss leads to the deconstruction of motherhood and increases role confusion. Bereaved mothers that I work with often question who they are and what they are living for. And if they have no living children, they struggle with how to identify as mother. Disenfranchised grief, which is caused by a mother losing her maternal identity without a live baby to have in her arms, is prevalent, and society does not recognize this type of death. Further, there's often intense social pressure to forget or get over, and I use those, very carefully, the baby who died, to move on to try to have other children. Unfortunately, in our society, we are still feeling pressure and hearing comments like that, that are high who are experiencing this type of loss. The mother's assumptive world is jeopardized, and things that once had meaning to her no longer do. Many women also place blame on themselves for the loss, experiencing significant guilt and feelings of failure as a woman or as a mother. Next slide, please. Everyone grieves differently, and there's no right or wrong way to deal with grief. Honoring a baby is also a process to each person. Expected that parents will never get over the death of their child, but the hope is that they will learn to loss, making it a part of who they are. Child's death may make people rethink their priorities and the meaning of life. It may seem impossible, but those who have lost usually do find happiness and purpose in life again. There is just no timeline for this. It is not uncommon for parents to remain connected to their baby and continue their relationship through ritual for many years after their death, as these rituals assist parents in feeling empowered. It may take many years to come to a sense of meaning and experience healing of some sort, but women who find meaning in their loss report decreased mental distress, increased marital satisfaction, ongoing bonds with their deceased child, and better physical health overall. For some parents, an important step may be creating a legacy for their child. They may choose to honor their child local hospital, cancer support organization, or some other organization that supports those who have lost or who are grieving, or they may start a memorial fund or plant trees in their child's memory. It is important to remember that it is never disloyal to a child for a parent to re-engage in life and to enjoy new experiences. A part of each child's legacy is that the changes he or she brings to a family continue after death. It's really important as healthcare providers that we continuously provide this reassurance and increase the confidence of parents as they navigate this journey and attempt to find hope and meaning. Next slide, please. So while a new pregnancy is often a positive event, for bereaved parents, this also raises anxiety and concern around a repeat loss. And research has demonstrated intense anxiety and increased depressive symptoms among perinatally bereaved women in subsequent pregnancies. Pregnancies that follow loss are often complex, with women experiencing heightened anxieties, fears of recurrence, or PTSD symptoms. Apprehension become more pronounced around the same gestational age that the previous baby died. Healthcare providers need to be especially sensitive during this stage and take care to provide regular contact and psychological support. It is always helpful for healthcare providers to have an understanding of the previous loss, even if they didn't work with or know the family during that time. As we can see, there are many triggers that could come up, and if the healthcare team is aware of the past loss and the conditions around that, they become better able to notice these triggers and support family. Women pregnant after stillbirth had a higher prevalence of anxiety, 22.5%, and depression, 19.7%, compared with women who had had a previous live birth. Gestational age at the time of stillbirth was not associated with depression and or anxiety. Studies have shown that parents with previous losses had significantly higher postpartum anxiety than parents with no history of perinatal loss. Couples who experienced the death of a baby were significantly more likely to have one or both partners distressed compared to non-bereaved couples. Further complicating this, studies have shown that prenatal anxiety is reported to be associated with increased risk of premature birth in subsequent pregnancies, and the existence of mental health problems is also an added risk factor for poor fetal outcomes during a subsequent pregnancy, and can also negatively affect the attachment to this child. As well, a child born to a depressed mother is more likely to suffer from depression later in life, which really points to the need to provide timely, comprehensive support to couples throughout the loss, grief and loss journey, and also as they plan for, prepare, or are going through a subsequent pregnancy. When a new baby is born, many parents then wrestle with balancing joy and the grief that they still carry from their previous loss. Infant loss support groups are well attuned to these issues, and it's important for healthcare providers to make parents aware of the resources in their area. In addition to the findings of increased vulnerability to depression and PTSD after perinatal loss, it is also worth noting that resilience can be a counterweight. It can help to mitigate distress in the face of loss and trauma in general, and perinatal loss in particular. Support networks, a major ingredient of resilience, were found to be significantly associated with less depression and PTSD. Another reason why it's really important for us to all be connecting families to groups where other people can understand what they're going through and can offer that camaraderie or mutual support. Next slide, please. So there are studies that demonstrate stillbirth and infant loss as major stressors associated with developing PTSD. These studies also mention that having good emotional support after the loss of a baby may be a protective for PTSD. So there are many different symptoms someone with PTSD may experience. In order to be diagnosed, you do not have to have all of the symptoms on this list, but the symptom list does include recurrent or unwanted distressing memories of the traumatic event, flashbacks or nightmares, severe emotional distress or physical reactions to something that reminds the person of the loss, avoiding places, activities, or people that remind the person of the traumatic loss or event, negative thoughts about oneself, other people, or the world, feelings of hopelessness, detachment, sadness, anger, guilt, shame, or irritability, difficulty concentrating, memory problems, difficulty maintaining or creating close relationships, lack of interest in activities, and becoming easily startled or frightened. Trouble sleeping and aggressive or reckless behaviors are other symptoms as well. Many people who are exposed to a traumatic event experience the symptoms listed above in the days following the event. However, for a person to be diagnosed with PTSD, symptoms have to last for more than a month. Many individuals do develop symptoms within 3 months of the traumatic loss, but symptoms can also appear later on in life. So that we always need to be aware of perinatal loss as being a risk factor for developing PTSD symptoms. Trauma and PTSD caused by losing a child can leave lasting scars that can completely alter a person's character and demeanor for the rest of their life if untreated. Seeking treatment can completely turn one's life around after a traumatic event such as this, giving them a chance to get back to the life before the trauma. Next slide, please. As much as it hurts, it is natural and normal to grieve. It may be helpful to suggest the following to grieving parents and their support systems. So first of all, talk about the child often and use his or her name. Have family and friends help with housework, errands, caring for other children. This will give parents time to grieve and to really process what all of their emotions mean to them. Prepare ahead of time for how to respond to difficult questions like how have, or hurtful comments like, at least you have other children. Prepare for how to spend significant days and talk to the individuals and couples you're working with about how triggering these specific anniversaries or dates can be. Some of these are anniversary of the child's death, Mother's Day and Father's Day, but many other sort of holidays or significant moments can also be very difficult. Because of the intensity and isolation of parental grief, parents may especially benefit from a support group where they can share their experiences with other parents who understand their grief and can offer hope. Next slide, please. Seeing someone struggle with perinatal loss can be difficult. As a healthcare provider or loved one, the most important tool for supporting someone through a perinatal loss is to listen. The hardest part of listening is to avoid the urge to fix what someone is going through. You might find yourself wanting to reassure that it will get better or that the loss was, quote, for the best. Even though you might mean well, the person grieving may be left feeling misunderstood and alone. Instead, expressing empathy, such as, this must be so hard, and offering help if you're a family member or friend. So for example, you might drop off meals or help with household tasks. As a healthcare provider, talk to your client about their inner circle of support and how to ask for help and advocate for them. It is important to be patient with grief. There's no specific timeline for how long it takes to cope with a perinatal loss. If your client is continuing to struggle with grief for an extended period of time, but again, going back to this idea of 12 to 18 months or longer being quite normal, you may consider suggesting that they seek professional support group. You can even offer to attend a support group with them for the first time, if this is allowed, or help them to find a therapist. Social support plays a massive role in buffering the effects of trauma and in mediating stress after bereavement. Women in particular, are often searching for an environment where they have permission to talk about their child's death and meet other mothers in a similar situation. Allowing mothers to express their emotions and retell their stories helps to decrease depression, self-blame, and trauma. And the same goes for fathers as well. Try to offer suggestions in a non-judgmental manner and avoid pressuring anybody to say yes, particularly in the moment. If your client is uncomfortable with the idea, respect their decision and continue to be there to listen and offer support that they are looking for. Next slide, please. Studies have shown that friends play a significant role in supporting mothers who had perinatal loss, whereby those who received support from friends were less stressed overall. It's important to recognize, however, that loved ones may be unsure how to approach a family experiencing a loss, which can lead parents to feel isolated and misunderstood. People who have experienced a similar loss before will be able to provide better support than those who have not. However, sometimes families feel quite alone in their family and social networks when they are grieving. Mothers with perinatal loss should be screened for psychosocial impact and offered support when needed. Over the last few decades, parents who have experienced perinatal loss have been advised to have contact with their deceased baby to facilitate a normal grief process. Seeing and or holding the infant after delivery or death is widely thought to identify who has been lost and create memories with which to grieve, thereby leading to improved psychosocial outcomes for parents. The vast majority of parents in the research appreciated contact when it was offered, and only a handful in one study believed seeing their baby affected them negatively, with none endorsing it as being traumatic, particularly if this is done well. Many perinatal bereavement organizations have issued guidelines about parental contact with an infant after death. Women in particular find bereavement support groups and talking with other parents helpful because they validate their experience, provide comfort and connection, and reverse isolation. As resilience is a character trait that has been observed to be a counterweight to mitigate distress and support networks. These networks are a key ingredient of building resilience and therefore are a key intervention. Support groups are associated with decreases in depression and PTSD, which is why we need to continuously be offering them as part of our treatment approach in different organizations that we work within, and to be aware of the groups that do exist and advocate and allow our clients to have access to all of these resources in a timely manner. Last slide, Kylie. Thanks. The emotional blow associated with child loss can lead to a wide range of psychological and physiological problems, including depression, anxiety, cognitive and physical symptoms linked to stress, marital problems, increased pain, and guilt. All of these issues can persist long after a child's death. The documented impacts on the mental health of fathers and mothers, as well as the effects on their relationship and the impact on siblings, indicate the urgent need for better support to parents experiencing the child. It is so important for all of us as healthcare providers to understand the complexity of grieving the loss of a baby or child, so that we can provide the validation, connection, support, and or treatment that is so needed. Last slide. Sorry, I feel like I rushed right through. I'm open for any questions. I can look at the chat, or if anybody wants to come off mute, I'm happy to chat.
Okay, so they don't have the ability to talk.
Okay.
So please, if you have questions, you can enter them into the chat box. I just want to say, Heather, that was a tremendous presentation. I agree. You probably could have talked for many more hours.
Yeah, it's really a whole workshop.
Yeah, but such important information for everybody. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I just want to say that we are a nonprofit organization. We offer virtual support groups for families, all different types of support groups. And we also have a pregnancy and infant loss directory that has links to other local support groups and support organizations, as well as mental health providers and doulas, like different type of support professionals. So if you're not on that and want to join that, you're welcome to. And I will send the links out when I send the recording link out. So Heather, someone's asking if they will receive a copy of the presentation. Are you okay sharing this PDF of the slides?
Yeah, absolutely. Whatever we are able to send, that's great.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, I'm so grateful for our TZ as well. I refer a lot of clients that direction, some great support groups.
Yeah, and I think in addition, I'll just talk about the support groups for a little bit. Our support groups are closed 6-week groups with an optional 4-week continued support. It works through a curriculum. And we have groups for pregnancy and infant loss. We're starting the pregnancy and infant loss for couples only. We do any unwanted pregnancy, which I know there's an organization called Any Unwanted Pregnancy that has a very large Facebook closed group, but we're probably, I think, one of the only groups in the US at least that are offering support groups for TFMR. We have a recurrent loss and infertility group. We have pregnancy after loss and parenting after loss. And I know you mentioned that a little bit, but even parenting after loss is like something that's not really talked about, but you're having a loss impacts you so much.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
And to that population, I think, is such a phenomenal resource for that reason, because lots of people aren't on the same journey. So accessing community support can be more challenging.
Okay, but thank you everyone who's joined us and who's joined us live or via recording. We appreciate you.
Thank you.